I was a United States Marine in 1969, deployed to Vietnam when I was barely old enough to understand what life really meant. I came home alive, yes, but a part of me never returned. People often think that once the war is over, you pack up your uniform, hang your medals, and move on. But that is not how it works. War clings to you. It follows you into your sleep, it seeps into your bones, and it reshapes the way you look at the world. Over the years, I have listened to many fellow veterans speak about their time in Vietnam. Some talk about the heat, the rice paddies, the mosquitoes, or the camaraderie with their brothers in arms. But very few, almost none, speak about the things that haunted us the most, the things that still wake us in the middle of the night 50 years later. Have you ever heard of something called a shit mine? Have you ever tried to eat your rations while sitting next to the rotting body of your friend, with the stench of death rising into the humid air? Have you ever seen a village you were ordered to burn, even though you knew there were children hiding inside? Those are not stories people tell at reunions. Those are the memories we bury deep inside because they are too painful, too shameful, too raw. But I am old now. My hands shake when I hold a pen and my voice cracks when I speak for too long. Yet, I feel a responsibility. If I do not tell the truth, then who will? If I do not say what really scarred us, then history will forget not only the lives we lost but also the souls that were shattered. So tonight, I want to open a door that has remained closed for decades. I want to share with you the 5 things that haunted me the most during my year in Vietnam. These are not tales of glory. They are not about medals or victories. They are about the dark underbelly of war, the part no one wants to remember but every veteran carries silently. When I look back, I realize that survival was not just about avoiding bullets. It was about enduring what you saw, what you smelled, what you were forced to do, and what you could never undo. I am not here to shock you, though the things I will say may disturb you. I am here to be honest because honesty is all I have left. I want you to imagine being 19 years old, standing in the middle of a jungle that seemed endless, where every tree, every shadow could hide an enemy. Imagine the sound of gunfire echoing in the distance, the smell of mud mixed with blood, the taste of fear in your mouth every single day. Now imagine carrying those sensations inside you, not for a week, not for a year, but for the rest of your life. That is what Vietnam gave us. People often ask veterans, what was the scariest part of the war? And I can never answer with just one thing. The truth is, it was 1,000 little things that piled up, layer after layer, until the weight crushed you. But if I had to choose, the 5 most haunting memories, the 5 nightmares that never leave me, they would be these. The first was the sight of bodies. Not just enemy bodies, but our own boys, men I laughed with just hours earlier. To see them lifeless, torn apart, left in the mud, and to still have to eat, still have to march, still have to pretend you could go on, it was unbearable. The second was the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics. They could be anyone, anywhere. A farmer by day, a soldier by night. A woman carrying a basket could be hiding a grenade. A child could be a scout. That paranoia never left us. The third, and maybe the most disgusting, was the so-called shit mines. A trap designed not just to kill but to humiliate, to break you mentally as well as physically. The fourth was the things I saw my fellow Marines do. Not all of them, but enough. The acts of violence not against the enemy but against civilians, against women, against the innocent. Those memories gnaw at me more than any bullet wound ever could. And the fifth was the orders we received from above. Orders that made no sense, that forced us to cross lines we never thought we would cross. Orders that turned boys into monsters, and left us questioning not only the war but ourselves. These are the ghosts that live with me. These are the 5 things I cannot forget no matter how many years pass. And yet, despite all the darkness, despite the nightmares that still claw at me, I cannot say that I regret serving. I was a Marine and I did my duty to my country. There is a strange kind of pride in that. Pride not in the killing, not in the destruction, but in the fact that I stood where I was told to stand, I carried the burden that was given to me and I survived. Even with the scars, I remain proud to have worn the uniform of the United States, and I will carry that honor until my last breath. And before I begin, let me leave you with this thought. War does not end when the last shot is fired. It continues in the minds of those who survived. The first memory that still claws at me is the sight of bodies, endless bodies in every state you could imagine. Some were fresh, some half buried in the mud, some bloated under the sun, turning shades of gray and green that no painter could ever reproduce. You cannot prepare a 19-year-old for that. You cannot prepare anyone for that. The first time I really saw it, was during an operation near Quang Nam. We had been moving through a stretch of jungle that seemed quiet, almost too quiet, and then we came across the remains of an earlier firefight. At first, I thought the ground was littered with broken equipment, helmets, boots, gear scattered everywhere. But as I looked closer, I realized those weren't objects. They were men. One of them still had his eyes open, staring blankly at the canopy above, as if he were trying to memorize the shape of the leaves before he left this world. Another had been blown apart, his body twisted in ways the human body should never bend. The smell hit me before the sight fully registered, sweet, sickening, the kind of stench that clings to your throat and makes it impossible to breathe. That night I tried to eat my rations, but I couldn't. My hands shook as I opened the can, and when I lifted the spoon, the odor of death still lingered in my nostrils. I turned to my left, and there he was, Johnson, a guy from Ohio I had joked with just the day before, lying next to me in a poncho cover because we hadn't had the time or the means to evacuate him yet. I sat there, chewing slowly, trying not to gag, pretending like it was just another meal. But it wasn't. It never would be again. We had a saying among the Marines: you eat when you can, you sleep when you can, you shit when you can. Survival meant routine no matter what was happening around you. But no one tells you that sometimes that routine includes eating next to your dead friend, because you don't have the luxury of mourning in the jungle. You can't stop. You can't break down. You just keep moving forward, carrying both your rifle and the weight of what you've seen. Over time, the sight of bodies became almost normal. I hate saying that, but it's the truth. We became numb to it because if we let it sink in every time, we would have gone insane. I remember stepping over corpses as casually as if they were logs on the trail. I remember poking at the ground with my boot to make sure what I saw wasn't a booby trap but just another swollen body. I remember thinking, at least it isn't me this time. But numbness doesn't mean you forget. The mind records everything even if you bury it deep. And at night, when the jungle was quiet, I could hear the buzzing of flies, I could smell the rot again, and I could see their faces staring back at me. One of the hardest things was how quickly a body would change in the heat. A man could be alive in the morning and unrecognizable by evening. His skin would balloon, his features would blur, and soon he would look like a stranger. That terrified me, not just because of the horror of decomposition, but because it meant even our memories of them were being stolen. The friend I knew was gone, replaced by something alien, something grotesque. The worst part was the guilt. We left bodies behind more times than I want to admit. Sometimes we just couldn't bring them out. The terrain was too rough, or the enemy was still too close, or the helicopters couldn't risk coming in. So we covered them as best we could, said a few words under our breath and moved on. To this day, I see their faces and wonder if anyone ever came back for them, or if they are still lying there in the mud, forgotten. I know some people picture war as fast, violent, but clean, like in the movies. Quick firefights, soldiers falling, fade to black. That is not how it was. In Vietnam, death lingered. It rotted in the sun. It swarmed with flies. It stared at you with empty eyes. And you had to walk past it every single day. And here is the cruel truth. After a while you stop flinching. You stop praying. You stop asking why. You just accept it as part of your world. That acceptance, I think, was the real horror. Because when you stop being horrified by death, when you can eat your meal with a corpse beside you, part of your humanity dies too. In Vietnam, death wasn't just something you saw on the battlefield. It sat next to you. It ate with you. It followed you into your dreams. It wasn't only our own dead that haunted me. The war in Vietnam was messy, brutal, and without clear lines. Sometimes the bodies I saw weren't Marines or Viet Cong soldiers but civilians. Old men who had been caught in crossfire, women whose homes had been shelled, children who had wandered into a minefield. I wish I could tell you those sights fade with time, but they don't. They stick to you like mud on your boots that you can never scrape off. There was a day near Da Nang when we came across a small hamlet that had been hit during a firefight. The huts were burned, the fields trampled, and the silence was unbearable. I stepped inside what had been someone's home and found 3 bodies, a woman and 2 small children. The woman's arms were wrapped around them as if she had tried to shield them from the blast. Their faces were frozen in fear, their eyes wide open. I stood there, rifle in my hand, and for a moment I forgot I was a soldier. I was just a 19-year-old kid staring at death in its most innocent form. That image still wakes me in the middle of the night. Then there were the enemy dead. Viet Cong, North Vietnamese soldiers. Men who fought just as hard as we did, who believed in their cause just as much as we believed in ours. Sometimes they looked no different from the farmers we saw every day. They were thin, young, often barefoot, and when they were killed they lay in the mud just like us. I remember looking at one man in particular, his AK-47 still by his side, his eyes half closed as if he were only sleeping. He couldn't have been more than 20. I remember thinking, if we had met anywhere else maybe we could have been friends. But here, in this jungle, we were enemies and only one of us walked away. What made it worse was the way death robbed people of their identity. A body quickly becomes just a body. You stop seeing a name, a story, a life. You start seeing them as objects in the landscape, something to step around, something to avoid touching. That kind of detachment is dangerous. It keeps you sane in the moment, but it eats away at you later, when you realize you let yourself forget that these were human beings. And then there were my brothers, my fellow Marines. Losing them was the hardest of all. Not just because they were my friends, but because their deaths forced me to confront my own survival. Why him and not me? Why did the bullet find his chest and not mine? Why did the mine go off when he stepped on it and not when I did? That kind of guilt doesn't fade. It festers. It whispers in your ear at night, telling you that you didn't deserve to come home. I remember one time, after a firefight, we had to load bodies into a helicopter for evacuation. The chopper blades whipped the air, dust and smoke filled our lungs, and we lifted the stretchers one by one. Some of the men still bled, others were already cold. I carried one stretcher with another Marine, and when we set it down, I realized it was Miller, the same guy who had given me a piece of chocolate from a care package just the day before. His eyes were still open, his mouth slightly ajar as if he was about to say something. But there was nothing left to say. You can tell yourself that you're hardened, that you've seen it all, but then you recognize a face. And suddenly, the wall you built around yourself cracks wide open. You can't unsee it. You can't push it away. The jungle itself became a graveyard. Sometimes the smell would hit you before the sight, the thick, choking stench of death, carried on the humid air. Other times it was the buzz of flies, a sound that became so distinct that I can still hear it today in the silence of my own bedroom. And then there were the vultures circling overhead, waiting for what we left behind. Even after 50 years, I can still picture their faces. The ones we buried, the ones we left, the ones we carried on stretchers. They live inside me, uninvited guests that never leave. And here's the cruelest part, I became good at pretending. I laughed, I joked, I ate my meals, I cleaned my rifle. I acted like I was fine. But deep down I wasn't. None of us were. We were just kids forced to walk through fields of the dead, and we never came back the same. Every corpse I saw in Vietnam was a reminder that I was still alive, and every time I wondered if I deserved to be. If the sight of bodies haunted me, then the second thing that tore at my soul was the way the Viet Cong fought. It was not a war of clear fronts or uniformed armies. It was a war of shadows, of whispers, of enemies that could vanish into the very earth itself. In Vietnam, the jungle was alive, not just with animals, not just with the hum of insects, but with eyes that watched us from every direction. The Viet Cong were masters of camouflage. They blended into the landscape in ways that seemed almost supernatural. You could stare at a tree for 5 minutes, swear it was just a tree, and then it would move because it was a man with a rifle, covered in leaves and mud. They dug tunnels that snaked beneath villages, beneath rice paddies, beneath our very feet. We could march over a patch of ground thinking it was solid, and beneath us was an entire network. Barracks, storage rooms, hospitals, command centers. It was like fighting ghosts. I remember one patrol where we came across what looked like an ordinary clearing. There were huts, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing. For once it felt safe, almost normal. We relaxed. Some of the guys even set their rifles down to drink water. That was when it happened. Gunfire erupted from every side. The huts that had looked harmless were suddenly spitting bullets. The women who had been cooking threw grenades. Even the children scattered, screaming, not in fear but as signals to the fighters hidden in the brush. Within seconds the clearing became hell. We scrambled for cover, returning fire blindly into the huts, into the trees, into the smoke. The noise was deafening. My ears rang, my heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I remember diving behind a low wall, the dirt exploding inches from my face as rounds slammed into it. I shouted for Johnson, only to remember that Johnson was already gone, left behind weeks earlier. That was the kind of madness Vietnam bred. Calling for men who were already dead because in the chaos you clung to anything familiar. When it was over, when the firing finally stopped, we moved cautiously through the village. The fighters were gone, melted back into the jungle, leaving only silence and bodies. We didn't know who had been enemy, who had been civilian, who had been both. That was the cruel trick of it. Anyone could be Viet Cong. The farmer with a hoe, the woman with a basket, the child with wide eyes. You never knew. And that uncertainty ate at you more than bullets ever could. We learned to fear the ground itself. Every step could be your last. There were punji pits, sharpened bamboo stakes smeared with filth, hidden beneath leaves. Step in the wrong place and your leg would be pierced, infection setting in before you could even scream. There were mines, tripwires strung so thin you couldn't see them until it was too late. Even water wasn't safe. Rivers could be mined, wells poisoned. The jungle wasn't just their home, it was their weapon. I can still see one night clearly. We had set up camp, exhausted after a long march. The night was quiet, too quiet. We posted guards, set up claymores, tried to rest. Around midnight the first shots cracked. Not an all-out assault, just a few bursts, enough to jolt us awake. We scrambled, firing into the darkness. But there was nothing there. Minutes later, another burst from the other side. We swung our rifles around, firing again, adrenaline surging. Again nothing. They were toying with us. By dawn, most of us hadn't slept a minute. We were shaking, eyes bloodshot, nerves shredded. That was the point. The Viet Cong didn't need to kill us every time, they just needed to make sure we never felt safe. That paranoia never left. Walking through a village, I would watch every face, every movement. Was the man smiling because he was friendly, or because he had planted a trap for us down the road? Was the woman bowing out of respect, or was she distracting us while someone else circled behind? Was that child running toward us for candy, or carrying a grenade? These thoughts never stopped. You couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who gave you water or rice. And once trust dies, something inside you dies too. I think that was part of the Viet Cong's genius. They didn't just fight us with rifles and mines, they fought us by poisoning our sense of reality. They turned every shadow into a threat, every smile into a suspicion. They made us doubt everything and everyone, even ourselves. In Vietnam, darkness didn't wait for nightfall. It was there in the daylight, hidden in plain sight, wearing a friendly face. The Viet Cong didn't need tanks or planes to terrify us. They had something far more powerful: patience, cunning, and the jungle itself. Every path, every rice paddy, every hut could hide a trap. And the cruelest part was that most of those traps didn't just kill, they maimed. They were designed to wound, to cripple, to scream. The punji pits were the worst of these. Simple, cheap, and devastating. A hole in the ground lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, often smeared with human waste to guarantee infection. Covered lightly with leaves, invisible until it was too late. One step and you were finished. Maybe not dead, but finished. I saw a man go in once. His leg was shredded, the stakes punching through his thigh. The scream that tore out of him was like nothing I had ever heard before, half pain, half pure terror. We dragged him out, but the infection set in quickly. Within days he was gone. Not from a bullet, not from an explosion, but from bamboo and filth. That was the kind of war we fought. Then there were the mines. Some were factory-made, others improvised. You never knew which. They could be under a trail, under a pile of dirt, even floating in the water where we went to wash. One time, a squad from our company was moving cautiously along a path that looked clear. No wires, no signs of disturbance. Suddenly the ground erupted. The explosion ripped through the air, leaving smoke and screams. When we reached them, the squad was gone. Just pieces left in the mud. That path had looked harmless. That's how it always was. The harmless things were the deadliest. The Viet Cong knew how to use psychology as a weapon. They didn't just want to kill us. They wanted to keep us afraid, always looking over our shoulders. Sometimes they'd fire a few shots and vanish, just to make sure we jumped at every rustle afterward. Sometimes they'd leave traps in places they knew we would come back to, like near water sources or on the trails to villages. They were patient. They could wait days, weeks for the right moment. And it worked. We lived in constant fear. We distrusted the jungle, the villages, even each other at times. Sleep was shallow, food tasteless, laughter forced. Every sound could be an ambush. Every shadow could hide an enemy. You could go from silence to chaos in a heartbeat. That's what wore us down. Not just the fighting, but the waiting, the uncertainty, the not knowing who or what was out there. I remember another night vividly. We were moving through dense brush, the kind of jungle where you could barely see 2 feet in front of you. The air was heavy, the sweat pouring down our faces. Suddenly, the man in front of me stopped. He had spotted something, a thin wire glinting in the faint light. A tripwire. We froze. One wrong move and half of us would have been torn apart. We stood there for what felt like hours, not daring to breathe until one of the engineers carefully disarmed it. That's how close it always was. Life and death, separated by a single thread of metal. Looking back, I think the worst part wasn't even the traps themselves. It was what they did to our minds. They made us suspicious of everything. They stripped away any sense of safety. We were Marines trained to be strong, to face the enemy head-on. But in Vietnam, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. They could be the old man handing you water, the child running by, the jungle itself. And when you start doubting every face, every step, every sound, you stop being human. You become a machine twitching at shadows, ready to shoot at anything that moves. That's what the Viet Cong tactics did to us. They didn't just wound our bodies. They wounded our minds. And those wounds lasted far longer than the physical ones. Even now, I can't walk into a crowded place without scanning every corner. I can't hike a trail without looking at the ground like it's going to explode. Vietnam taught us that safety is an illusion, and once you learn that lesson, you never forget it. And here's the thing. As much as we hated them, as much as we cursed their tricks and their shadows, we couldn't help but respect them. They were fighting on their own land, with fewer resources, less firepower, but with an ingenuity that matched and sometimes surpassed ours. They were ghosts in the jungle, and we were just strangers stumbling through their world. In Vietnam, darkness didn't just belong to the night. It hid in daylight, in villages, in the very ground beneath our feet. But not every death came from bullets or bamboo. Sometimes, it came from things so absurd, so foul, that even now I can barely speak of them. That brings me to the third horror, something we call the shit mines. If there is one thing that still makes my stomach twist after all these years, it is what we came to call the shit mines. Even now, saying those words out loud feels surreal, almost absurd, like something out of a nightmare. But they were real, and they were among the most grotesque weapons I ever encountered in Vietnam. The concept was simple, but cruel beyond imagination. The Viet Cong would take a standard mine, or sometimes an improvised explosive, and cover it with human waste. Sometimes they didn't even need the explosive. They would simply leave piles of excrement scattered across an area they knew we would pass through. We never knew which pile was harmless and which one would kill us. That was the genius of it, the uncertainty. Imagine walking through the jungle after days of patrol, hot, thirsty, exhausted. You come across a patch of ground fouled with waste. Disgusting, yes, but not unusual. We had been in the bush long enough to know that people relieved themselves wherever they could. But then the question always hit you: was this just filth, or was it death? Was this a pile of human waste, or was it sitting on top of an explosive waiting for the first unlucky Marine to step on it? I remember one patrol in particular. We had been moving near a riverbed when one of the guys ahead suddenly cursed and froze. He had stepped into a pile of waste, and for a split second, none of us knew what was going to happen. We waited, breath held, eyes wide, rifles ready. Nothing exploded. He pulled his boot free, smeared and stinking, and we all exhaled. But then came the second thought. The Viet Cong knew that a man stepping in waste would want to wash it off. And where would he go? To the nearest water source. Which, of course, they had off in mind. That's what made it so horrifying. It wasn't just the mine itself. It was the trap behind the trap, the chain of logic that forced you into danger no matter what you did. If you ignored it, you risked infection, disease. If you cleaned it, you risked stepping into a minefield. Either way, you were damned. There was one squad, we heard about it over the radio, that got wiped out this way. They had stumbled into an area littered with waste, some real, some concealing mines. A few men stepped in it, cursed, then made their way to a nearby creek to clean themselves. That's when the explosion started. Mines along the banks detonated, tearing through the squad. By the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left but pieces in the water. That was the day I realized just how far the Viet Cong were willing to go, how deep into the psychology of war they would reach. The smell was unbearable. I can tell you this. Nothing lingers in your memory like the stench of human waste mixed with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of explosives. Even now, sometimes when I pass a sewer or catch a foul odor in the air, my chest tightens and I'm back in that jungle, gagging, rifle in hand, waiting for the ground to explode. What made these shit mines especially cruel was that they attacked every part of you, your body, your senses, your dignity. War already strips you down, takes away your humanity piece by piece. But this humiliated you while it killed you. It forced you into filth, made you stink, made you despise yourself even before the explosion. It was psychological warfare at its most intimate level. Some of the men never recovered from the humiliation. It's one thing to get wounded in battle, it carries a grim kind of honor. But to be wounded or killed because you stepped in human waste, that felt degrading in a way that words can barely capture. The men joked about it sometimes, dark humor being the only shield we had. But beneath the laughter was fear, and beneath the fear was shame. I can still see the look on a friend's face after he narrowly avoided one. His boot had brushed against a mound, and for a second we all thought he was done. When nothing happened, he laughed, a hollow, shaky laugh. But later that night, I saw him sitting alone, staring at his boot as if it had betrayed him. That's the kind of madness those traps bred. The constant second-guessing, the inability to trust even your own footsteps. War isn't just about bullets and bombs. Sometimes it's about filth, about being forced to live like an animal, about losing even the shred of dignity you thought you had left. One of the hardest memories I carry comes from a patrol in early '69. We were moving through a swampy area, the kind of place where the air itself felt rotten. The stench was everywhere, and at first we thought it was just the swamp. Then we realized the ground was littered with human waste. Some of the guys groaned, pulling their scarves over their noses. We tried to step carefully, but that was like walking through a minefield where the mines were invisible. Then it happened. A Marine named Turner, barely 20 years old, stepped into one of those piles. The explosion ripped through the air. The sound was deafening, the shockwave knocking me to the ground. When the smoke cleared, I saw him lying there, torn apart, his body mangled beyond recognition. And the smell, God, the smell, was worse than the sight. Blood, smoke, and human waste mixed together in a stench that still makes me gag when I think of it. We tried to save him, but there was no saving to be done. Turner died in the mud, surrounded by filth, his last breath stolen by one of the most degrading weapons ever conceived. To this day, when I think of him, I don't see a brave Marine, I don't hear his laughter from back at camp. I see the way he looked that day, broken and smeared with filth. And that feels like the cruelest betrayal of all. Some of the men broke down after that. They cursed, they cried, they swore revenge. Others shut down completely, walking on as if nothing had happened. That's how war twists you. It gives you two options: scream until you break or feel nothing at all. Both leave scars that never heal. The shit mines weren't just traps. They were symbols of a war that stripped us down, reduced us to less than human. In combat, you expect to die from bullets, from shells, from bombs. Those are things you can at least wrap your mind around. But to die covered in human waste? To have your body destroyed and humiliated at the same time? That was something none of us were prepared for. And the worst part was how it followed us home. Even years later, the smell could bring it all back. I remember one time back in the States, I was walking down a street when I caught a whiff from an overflowing sewer. In an instant, I was back in that swamp, watching Turner die. My knees buckled and I nearly collapsed right there on the sidewalk. People stared, but they couldn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what I had seen, smelled what I had smelled. There's also the shame. Veterans don't talk about this one much. It feels too dirty, too humiliating to admit that something like human waste could undo you. We'd rather talk about firefights, about bravery, about the traditional horrors of war. But the truth is, some of the deepest scars come from the things no one wants to speak about. And the Viet Cong knew that. They knew that even if we survived the explosions, the memory itself would poison us forever. Dark humor was our shield. We joked about "watch where you shit," or "don't trust a pile unless you made it yourself." The laughter helped, but only on the surface. At night, when the jungle grew quiet, the laughter faded, and the silence filled with the memory of those screams. I often wonder if the men who set those traps thought about what they were doing. Did they laugh when they buried the mines under filth? Did they believe it was justice, revenge, necessity? Or did they just see it as another tool of war, no different from a rifle? I'll never know. All I know is that it worked. It terrified us, disgusted us, broke us down in ways no bullet ever could. Even now, after more than 50 years, I still struggle to put it into words. How do you explain a war where death smelled like waste, where survival meant stepping lightly not just to avoid bullets but to avoid filth that could kill you? How do you tell people that sometimes the thing you feared most wasn't the enemy with a gun, but the ground beneath your feet? Some wounds are invisible. Some scars don't show. And some of the worst memories of war come not from the killing, but from the humiliation. And that brings me to another truth, one I hate speaking about but cannot ignore. Not all of the horrors I witnessed came from the enemy. Some of them came from our own men, things I wish I could forget but never will. This is the part one hate talking about the most. Not because it didn't happen, but because it did. Because I saw it with my own eyes. Because it wasn't the Viet Cong who did it, it was our own men. My brothers, my fellow Marines. War doesn't just kill bodies. It kills morality piece by piece. In the heat of the jungle, in the endless boredom between firefights, in the bitterness of losing friends, some men gave in to their darkest instincts. And I watched it happen, powerless to stop it. I remember the first time. We had entered a small village after a firefight. The huts were half burned, the air heavy with smoke and fear. Women and children huddled in corners, wide-eyed, trembling. At first, it was quiet, just the sound of boots on dirt, rifles clicking, orders barked. Then one of the guys grabbed a young woman, dragging her out into the open. She screamed, kicked, clawed, but it didn't matter. The others laughed, jeered, egged him on. And then more joined in. I froze. I wanted to move, to stop it, to shout, but my legs felt like stone. My rifle hung uselessly in my hands. I told myself, this isn't happening, this can't be happening. But it was. The woman's cries cut through the air, raw and desperate, echoing in my skull. And the worst part? The faces of my own comrades, twisted not with fear, not with rage, but with something animalistic. Something that had nothing to do with duty, nothing to do with survival. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice. I saw her face. I smelled the smoke, the sweat, the fear. And I hated myself, for standing there, for doing nothing. People think the enemy haunts you. Sometimes it's your own silence that haunts you more. It didn't just happen once. I wish I could say it was an isolated moment of madness, but it wasn't. It happened again and again. Some men treated it like a routine, like another weapon of war. They justified it by saying they could be Viet Cong. They could be hiding weapons. They deserve it. What? Excuses. We all knew it. But in war, excuses become armor, and armor keeps you from facing the truth. I began to see villages not as places of life, but as places of dread. Every time we entered one, I prayed it wouldn't happen again. But too often it did. A woman dragged out, children crying, men standing by in silence. I felt complicit even when I didn't touch a single soul. Silence is its own form of participation. That's something I've carried with me all my life. Some of the women we encountered, I still see their eyes. Not their faces, not their words, but their eyes. Eyes that looked straight through me as if to say, you could have stopped this. You could have been different. And they were right. I could have. I should have. But I didn't. And that truth has carved its way into my soul deeper than any bullet wound ever could. What I realized later is that rape in war isn't just about sex. It's about power. It's about stripping someone of their dignity, their humanity. It's about turning them into an object, a spoil, a thing to be conquered. And in that moment, the men who did it lost their own humanity too. They crossed a line you can't uncross. But that's the thing about Vietnam, it blurred every line. Right and wrong, soldier and civilian, survival and cruelty. It twisted men into monsters and the rest of us into silent witnesses. And the silence is what I can't forgive myself for. Sometimes the darkest enemy isn't the one you face across the battlefield. It's the one standing right beside you. There was another night that has never left me. We were on a sweep through a village in Quang Nam. The sun was setting, painting the huts in shades of red, the air heavy with smoke from the cooking fires. At first, everything seemed calm. Children peeked at us from doorways, women carried water. Then one of the Marines, someone I had trained with, someone I had laughed with, shoved a woman against a wall. She cried out, her bucket crashing to the ground, water spilling into the dust. I shouted. I don't even remember what I said, just that the words came out raw, desperate. For a second he froze. But then another Marine stepped in, laughing, pulling at her clothes. The others joined, and my voice drowned in the chaos. I stood there shaking, my rifle heavy in my hands, my chest burning with rage and shame. I wanted to raise my weapon to force them off her, but I couldn't. Part of me feared what would happen if I did. Would I be court-martialed, abandoned, maybe even shot in the back for betraying my own? So I stood frozen again, watching the same horror unfold, hating them, hating myself more. When it was over, the woman lay in the dirt, her face turned away, silent tears streaking her cheeks. I tried to meet her eyes, but she wouldn't look at me. She didn't need to. The weight of her silence said everything. What haunts me most isn't just what they did. It's the silence of everyone else. Some watched. Some turned away. Some lit cigarettes and pretended not to hear. A few laughed like it was some kind of twisted game. Only a handful looked sick like me. But none of us stopped it. None of us had the courage to cross that line. That's what war does. It eats away at your morality until silence feels like the safest option. You tell yourself, if I speak up, I'll be the next target. If I intervene, I'll be thrown out or worse. And so you swallow your rage. You bury your conscience. And every time you do, a part of you dies along with the victims. When I came back to the States, I couldn't talk about it. Not to my family, not to my wife, not even to the other veterans. How could I? People wanted stories of heroism, of sacrifice, of camaraderie. They didn't want to hear about Marines brutalizing villagers. And I was terrified of what they'd think of me if I told the truth, that I was complicit, that I had stood by and done nothing. So I stayed silent. For decades. But silence doesn't erase memory. Silence is a prison. Even now, more than 50 years later, I still see those women when I close my eyes. I hear their cries in my nightmares. And I feel the weight of their stares, accusing me of cowardice. Sometimes people ask me what the worst thing I saw in Vietnam was. They expect me to say firefights, ambushes, explosions. And yes, those were horrific. But the truth? The worst thing I saw was the evil that came from within our own ranks. Because bullets, bombs, and traps are the enemy's weapons. But rape, that was ours. That was something we did to ourselves, to our souls. And it leaves a different kind of scar. Not the kind that shows on your skin, but the kind that gnaws at you from the inside. A scar of shame, of guilt, of knowing that you failed, not just as a soldier but as a man, as a human being. In Vietnam, I learned that sometimes the enemy doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes the enemy is inside you, and that is the hardest battle you'll ever lose. And that brings me to the final horror I carry. Not the traps, not the shadows, not even the shame of silence. But the orders we received from above, the commands that demanded we abandon our humanity in the name of victory. War is supposed to be about following orders. That's what they drill into you from the very beginning. Obey. Do as you're told. The mission comes first. And for a while I believed it. I was a Marine, I lived by the chain of command. But Vietnam broke that belief. The orders we received were not just dangerous. They were senseless, cruel. Sometimes they were outright immoral. And they came from men who sat in safe bases, drinking coffee, looking at maps. Men who never had to see what their decisions looked like when carried out in blood and fire. I remember one operation in particular. We had been told that a village was harboring Viet Cong. No proof, no evidence, just intelligence reports. The order was clear: eliminate the threat. That meant going in hard, no questions asked. Burn the huts, clear the fields, neutralize everyone inside. Everyone. We moved in at dawn. The village looked like every other village. Mud huts, chickens running loose, children playing in the dirt. At first glance, it looked peaceful, even fragile. But we had our orders. So we kicked in doors, dragged people out, fired at shadows. A man ran, someone shouted Viet Cong. And before we could blink, he was lying in the dirt, dead. His wife clutched his body, screaming. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a threat. But she was treated like collateral damage, just another consequence of following orders. That day, I saw something break in the eyes of my fellow Marines. Some carried out the commands with cold efficiency, shutting off their emotions. Others hesitated, flinched, shook as they pulled the trigger. And some seemed to revel in it, as if the chaos gave them permission to unleash something dark inside themselves. When it was over, the village was gone. Smoke rose from the huts. The cries of women and children echoed in my ears. And I kept thinking, this wasn't war. This was murder. But the report that went up the chain of command said otherwise. It said mission successful. Enemy neutralized. No mention of the blood in the dirt. No mention of the children crying for fathers who would never return. That's the thing about irrational orders. They don't just kill civilians. They kill the soldier inside you. Every time you obey, you bury another piece of your soul. And yet, if you disobey, you risk court-martial, prison, abandonment. Either way, you lose. Another time, we were told to clear an area of jungle suspected of hiding tunnels. That meant using flamethrowers, napalm, explosives, scorched earth. We knew there were families in the area. We knew villages sat on the edge of those trees. But the order was clear. Nothing left standing. We watched fire consume the jungle, watched animals scream and scatter, watched huts catch fire with people still inside. And once again the official report called it a victory. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like damnation. The worst part was knowing the futility of it all. We'd burn a village one day and a week later Viet Cong would be back in the same area, stronger than before. We weren't winning anything. We were just piling up bodies, stacking grief on grief. And the ones giving the orders never had to smell the smoke, never had to hear the screams. That's when I began to realize that the real enemy wasn't always the Viet Cong. Sometimes, the real enemy sat behind a desk, thousands of miles away, turning human lives into numbers on a report. The hardest thing about Vietnam wasn't facing the enemy's bullets. It was carrying out our own orders, knowing deep down that we were becoming the very monsters we thought we were fighting. Another order that still burns in my memory was the obsession with body count. That's how success was measured in Vietnam, not by territory held, not by villages secured, not by lives saved. Just by numbers. How many bodies you could stack in a day. That was victory, at least on paper. I'll never forget a patrol in the Central Highlands. We had run into a group of armed men, maybe Viet Cong, maybe farmers forced to carry weapons. The firefight was quick, chaotic, and when the smoke cleared, there were bodies on the ground. Some were armed, some were not. A lieutenant walked through, counting out loud like he was reading off a grocery list. 1, 2, 3. Each body a number, each number a mark of success. Then he looked at a wounded man crawling through the mud. The man wasn't a threat anymore. He was bleeding out, gasping for air. But the lieutenant turned to one of the Marines and said, "Finish him. We need the count." And the Marine did. One more number for the report. That day I realized how far we had fallen. War had stopped being about fighting for freedom or protecting South Vietnam, or any of the things they told us back home. It was about numbers, statistics, making the higher-ups feel like they were winning. And we were the ones forced to do the dirty work, to turn human lives into data points. It didn't end there. Sometimes when the count was too low, the orders were clear: find more. That meant searching villages, rounding up men who looked the right age, branding them as enemy and pulling the trigger. Some resisted. Some begged. Some just stood frozen, staring at us with hollow eyes. And every time I felt a little more of myself die. The body count warped everything. It turned death into currency and soldiers into collectors. It made you stop seeing faces, stop seeing people. Just numbers. And when you stop seeing people as people, you stop being human yourself. Back home, the report sounded clean, efficient, X number of enemy neutralized. No one talked about the old man with shaking hands who had no weapon. No one mentioned the boy barely 16 whose body added to the total. No one wrote about the children screaming as their fathers fell. And yet, we were told we were doing our duty. We were told we were making America safer. But deep down we knew. We weren't fighting for freedom. We weren't fighting for peace. We were fighting for the next report, the next set of numbers, the next illusion of progress. That's when the betrayal hit me hardest. Not from the Viet Cong, not from the jungle, not even from the war itself. But from the leaders who sent us there, who gave us impossible orders, who demanded obedience while keeping their own hands clean. We were dying for numbers. We were killing for numbers. And when we came home broken, scarred, haunted, those same leaders pretended they didn't know why. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had refused. If I had thrown down my rifle and said, "No more." Maybe I would have been court-martialed. Maybe I would have disappeared into a prison cell. Or maybe I would have been shot accidentally in the next firefight. I'll never know. All I know is that I didn't refuse. I followed orders like the Marine Corps trained me to do. And that's a burden I'll carry to my grave. In Vietnam, we weren't just fighting an enemy. We were fighting the weight of orders that forced us to trade our humanity for survival. and that is a war I know I lost. And now, looking back after more than half a century, I can say this: war does not end when the guns fall silent. It lingers. In the memories, in the nightmares, in the guilt you carry. These 5 horrors, the bodies, the shadows, the traps, the silence, and the orders, they live inside me still. And maybe by telling them, by speaking the things no one wants to hear, I can finally lay some of them to rest. So there you have it, the 5 horrors that have haunted me for more than 50 years. 5 things I can't drink away, can't bury, can't silence, no matter how much I've tried. The bodies, the shadows, the traps, the silence, the orders, each one carved into my soul like a scar that never fades. When people talk about Vietnam, they talk about strategy, politics, victories, and losses. But the truth of war isn't in the speeches or the textbooks. The truth is in the memories of men like me, men who carried rifles through jungles, men who walked into villages and didn't come out the same. I wish I could tell you that the war ended when I came home. That when the plane touched down, I could finally breathe again, finally leave the nightmares behind. But it didn't. The war followed me, into my dreams, into my family, into every quiet moment where the ghosts come creeping back. And yet I am still proud. Proud that I served my country. Proud that I wore the uniform of the United States Marine Corps. Proud that I stood with my brothers, even in the darkest times. But that pride lives alongside guilt, alongside shame, alongside the heavy knowledge that I saw and sometimes participated in things that should never happen. That is the weight of moral injury. It's not just about what was done to you. It's about what you did or didn't do. It's about the silence, the choices, the things you carry because you can't undo them. Bullets wound the body. Moral injury wounds the soul. I share these memories not to shock you, not to glorify them, but because they are the truth. And the truth matters. Too often, the stories of war get polished, cleaned up, turned into tales of bravery and honor. And yes, there was bravery. Yes, there was brotherhood. But there was also horror. And if we forget the horror, we risk repeating it. To those who never fought in Vietnam or in any war, I hope you listen. I hope you understand that war is not just glory and flags and medals. War is rot. War is broken minds. War is children without fathers, women without dignity, men without their humanity. And to my fellow veterans, if you're out there carrying your own ghosts, know this: you're not alone. I've carried mine for decades. I still do. But speaking them, sharing them, gives them less power. Maybe it's the only way we can survive what we survived. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this: war doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It lives on, in the scars, in the memories, in the moral wounds. And those wounds don't just belong to the soldiers. They belong to all of us because war shapes the world we all live in. The real cost of war isn't measured in battles won or lost. It's measured in the souls of the men who fought it, and in the silence of those who never came home.